I'm Stephanie Feldstein, Population and Sustainability Director with the Center for Biological Diversity. I'm here today with Alan Weisman, author of the new book, Countdown. Alan is an award-winning journalist whose previous book, A World Without Us, went on to be an international bestseller. Alan, in your previous book, you imagined how the world would heal without the constant pressure of human population. And in this book, in some ways, you traveled around the world and you asked what many experts called the most difficult questions, the most important questions, which are also some of the most difficult, complex, and controversial questions. Why did you decide to write this book?
Well, because I wrote The World Without Us because I want a world with us. But I had to first sort of theoretically remove us from the planet to get a sense of how much the planet could recover if relieved by all the pressures that were just constantly piling on top of it, in hopes that readers would, by the end of it, think, is there any way that we can still be a part of this picture? But as I discovered, and I frankly didn't know until I got towards the end of that book, the rate of our increase on this planet it's 1 million people every 4 to 4.5 days, and that did not seem sustainable at all. So at the end of the book, I kind of raised the ante a little bit, wondering if in order to have a world with us that also included that nature, because frankly we can't be here unless our natural base is here, might we not have to consider limiting our recruitment of future human beings to replace ourselves for a generation or two until we come down to some sort of sustainable size. And so many people were interested in that after a while it just became logical that I should really examine this question. And examine it as a journalist. Though I have deep sympathies for the environmental movement because I love nature. As a journalist, I don't belong to any environmental groups, so I can't get trashed by anybody who's saying, he's a member of the Sierra Club, or he's, a fellow of the Center for Biological Diversity, or whatever. I'm just a journalist who is trying to look at hard questions. And population is one of the most loaded questions on the planet because it's very emotional, and religion and all sorts of other things get involved.
Yeah, and along those lines, there's a great passage in here where you wrote, "To judge that a charismatic polar bear or cuddly panda is more significant than some inconspicuous brown bird hopping unnoticed on a forest floor, and therefore more crucial to save, is the ecological equivalent of Sophie's choice. No one wants to make such a decision, yet this is a world where many people are skeptical that species other than edible domestic animals are particularly important at all." In your research, what did you discover about the importance of protecting biodiversity?
Well, those 4 questions that you mentioned, I can tick them off really fast. How many people can fit on this planet without tipping it over? How much nature do we have to preserve, and can we know which species are essential to us? Now, frankly, in The World Without Us, I showed that species are just as important as ours. Every species eventually goes extinct. We will too someday, but part of the beauty of The World Without Us is that life will go on. It's very resilient. But to really get readers to sign on to something as difficult to embrace as the idea of not embracing so much so we can be fewer to remain in balance with nature, you really have to talk to their self-interest. So I asked that important environmental question in terms of how much nature do we need to preserve ourselves? Well, we can get to the other 2 questions later, but in terms of that one, some experts who told me that these were the most important questions on Earth also said they may be impossible to solve. And I think that's one that is impossible because we really won't know the answer until we eliminate one species too many, and then it'll be too late to pull it back. So there are several examples in this book that suggest that, it's dumb to keep playing with a system that just lets more and more and more grow extinct every year, and actually the rate of extinction is increasing. This is absolutely insane. We have thrived as a species on this planet because we've had all these other species, because we've had all the things that they do. Just one quick example in the book. I start this book out in sort of the hotbed of this demographic situation, Israel and Palestine. Two peoples trying to outpopulate each other to be the majority in one very resource-poor land. But one of the resources in which Israel is particularly rich turns out to be bird life. And I never really knew that until I traveled around Israel for a while with an ornithologist who helped me to understand something that, oh, that makes sense. That birds who migrate between Africa and Eastern and Western Europe tend to avoid going across the Mediterranean because they don't have thermals. So they go over Israel. That was also the land bridge that human beings used when we came out of Africa. And every year there's 1 billion migrating birds that cross back and forth. Now, if Israel runs out of water and its wetlands dry up, where there's not enough trees for roosting for those species, what's going to happen, not just to their ecosystem, but to Africa and to Europe that needs those birds, not just because they sing pretty, but because they're seed spreaders, they are pollinators, and they're insect eaters. The whole ecosystem would just flop in unexpected and scary ways if we didn't have those birds. So every single little place on Earth ultimately is housing something that probably it's not a good idea to mess with the system and run that species off.
Makes a lot of sense to us. Earlier you had mentioned that, population questions are among the most loaded. In your travels, what did you find was the best way to start having that conversation with people and get them talking about the issues?
Well, the third question that I was asking was there anything in a given culture's, and I went to 21 countries to really take the temperature of a lot of the world's cultures, was there anything in their histories or in their liturgies, in their holy books, or in their present circumstances that without telling them you're wrong, you have to believe this instead of what you believe, was there something within their belief system that would accommodate this idea that in times of crisis, it's not a good idea to keep expanding if the resources are starting to dwindle? And that was really the question. I asked people, I sat down with Muslim scholars of the Quran, and I said, does Muhammad talk about our responsibility to the earth? And does he say anything about ourselves and how we might become too excessive? Well, it turns out that in many places in the Quran, he does talk about stewardship, that this is one of the human obligations to take care of this beautiful temple that God gave us, Allah gave us. But also, there is a very, very firm mandate having to do with mother's milk. And this is a surah, a verse in the Quran that family planners in Islamic countries are using, and they're using it with great effectiveness, because when they talk to imams, they say, look, it's right here in the Quran. And what it says is that every child who is born is entitled to at least 2 years of mother's milk. Now, to do that, you got to space your births. You can't just keep popping them out over and over. And that is a way of helping. The Mormons, who have large families, when I went to speak to them about this, and I did a little homework, and I found out that even in Mormon history, they have large families for the same reason that the Israelites had large families. Fill the earth, multiply, build a mighty nation fast before some other nation like the Canaanites, usurp them. In the case of the Mormons, they were polygamists, like those early Israelites, to populate Utah as fast as they could. But then the United States came down on them and said, polygamy doesn't work here. So the Mormons went to just one wife per man, but they kept having a lot of babies, and soon they found themselves in a crisis, because women were dying in childbirth because their bodies had not recovered fully from the last pregnancy. Now, what I discovered was that fortunately, Mormons are also a very education-oriented religion, as well as a family-oriented religion, and they had encouraged a lot of students to go to universities, and there was now a generation of Mormon doctors who started counseling women and say, for the good of yourself and for your family and for our family-based community, you have to space your children for, for the sake of the mother. So what I talked to these people who I met there was, I said, well, is it possible that in the age that we've come into right now, that for the sake of Mother Nature, we have to space our children even farther to save this? And I found a really receptive audience. Mormons, like anybody else, are really concerned about the fact that from, Provo down to Ogden, did I get that backwards? There's this huge strip city, and the traffic is terrible, and the smog bouncing off the mountains is awful, and they're running out of water. They're in the Colorado River, basin. And everywhere I went in the world, I looked for ways to show, to try to get people to show me that this isn't saying that you're wrong. You've been right all along. This is something that you have in your belief system that would work.
And to bring that back to, because you did travel worldwide, and to bring that back to the U.S., what are some things that you would recommend that everyday people here can do in their own lives to help reduce the pressure of population on the environment?
Well, one thing that we do pretty well, and we can do even better, is focus on education. Because it turns out that education is the best contraceptive of all. A woman anywhere who gets through high school usually will have just 2 children, because with her schooling, it opens up opportunities to earn money for her family and also to lead an interesting life as well as be a mother. And you can't do that with having 5 or 6 kids. So we have to foster education. We have to show that big families have a harder time than smaller families. I mentioned in the book that Mexico, which when I lived there in the 1970s, had the highest birth rate on earth. And they turned that around with a program that basically did 2 things. One, it made contraception available to women, but at the same time it was making vaccines available to women, so they knew that their existing children would not die on them. So they didn't have to have as many children, which was a great relief. I was living in rural Mexico, and I know a lot of women who were really excited. But the other thing they did was use the telenovela, soap operas, and a very visionary director named Miguel Sabido did this series of soap operas that ran for 10 years that basically showed that smaller families have a lot fewer problems than bigger families. And sometimes the tension in the soap opera was the wife wanting to use birth control and the macho man saying, I'm not, and then gradually he comes around. And you can just track the drop in Mexican birth rate by those soap operas. Well, there's a group called the Population Media Center that is now doing soap operas in dozens of languages. And they just helped produce a series that ran in East Los Angeles called Istla, which is slang for East Los Angeles. And it's the same message. And it's really good theater. It's good TV. You see young high school age girls getting into all kinds of issues. And of course, the ones that get pregnant, that suddenly really starts to diminish her opportunities out there. So the message can get across. But most important, one other thing, I'm going to put a plug for the U.S. government. One of the things that we've done really well is USAID. We started bringing birth control when the pill was invented to the world. And partly we did it, the history is in my book, in Latin America, because USAID was sort of our response to the big billboard for communism called Cuba that the Soviet Union had at the same time. And it turned out that women in Latin America were very receptive to it. It also turns out that evangelical churches realized, wow, the Catholics are telling women they're sinners if they want to be responsible about childbirth. So they started telling women, there's nothing that, God doesn't say you can't use this stuff. God loves you for being a responsible parent and having just the number that you can feed. And that has had an enormous effect in Latin America, and USAID is now one of the biggest funders of contraception in the world. And that's someplace that I like to see my tax dollars go.
What role do you think that personal choices here in the U.S. play in terms of sustainability and overconsumption on issues?
Well, personal choice is the only way to go, I think, in this world. You got to show people it's in their best interest to do something, because nobody likes government mandates. That's why the one-child policy of China is just, so odious to so many people, because nobody wants a government telling you what to do. So if we can get people to believe that having fewer children is in their best interest, and the best interest for their other children, in that consuming less is the best, showing them that you can have a really nice life if you're not constantly feeling that you've got to fill it up with more toys that are really exciting for a day or two, and then suddenly they're not as exciting, and then your gratification reflex means you've got to go out and buy another toy. We have to get people to realize that having toys that last longer and enjoying the toys that nature provides for us, just going out and taking a deep breath of fresh air and looking at something that's remaining beautiful, that's really, really helpful. But I'm not going to minimize the difficulty of the problem that we have, because all of us are addicted to energy. We flip on the light switch in the morning, we use our computers, we drive, maybe we try to minimize our driving, or we try to drive a car that's a hybrid or whatever. But there's a study that I mentioned in this book. Two professors from Oregon State quantified how much carbon dioxide is produced by a woman who's trying everything: compact fluorescent lights, driving a Prius, all of these things, really trying to minimize her footprint. But how much extra carbon every child will produce. And it turns out to be thousands of tons, because children will then have more children. So it looks like that one of the best things that we can do to lower consumption is to try to minimize the number of consumers.
Thank you so much for sitting down with us and writing this book.
Well, thank you so much. My pleasure, and congratulations on the work you're doing.
Thanks a
Thank
lot.
you for it.